I'm David Robson, and that's my wife, Ursula Robson.
And I'm Richard
Robinson. And I, just to put you in the context and the background, I studied architecture at University College London. I'm from Stockton-on-Tees originally, but the master plan for Washington was done in the mid-60s by Richard Llewellyn-Davis and his partner, John Weeks. And Llewellyn-Davis was my professor at University College. So from a very early moment, I was aware of and sort of peripherally involved with the whole idea of the master plan, because whilst we were students, we were set little things to do with it. But also the students who were 3 or 4 years older than me went and worked in Llewellyn-Davis' offices, and many of the drawings in the master plan book were done by people I knew, you see. So that was the background. And that I didn't have any plan. I finished my studies in 1968. And then I went to, after a brief working in London, I went to Sri Lanka, where I was helping to set up a school of architecture with my wife, first when we got married. And then we came back after 2 years in Sri Lanka, and I did a year working in Switzerland because Ursula is Swiss and wanted to work in. And I got a lot of varied experience in Switzerland, and then decided I wanted to come back to this country. And at that moment in time, the Washington Development Corporation was advertising for architects. And so I applied, and I came back from Switzerland to work in Washington in 1973. And at that time, we didn't have a home in this country, and we were allocated a house in Blackfell on Striding Edge. So my wife, it was our first real home in this country, and I started work in the Development Corporation. And at that time, the chief architect was Eric Watson, and the chief planning officer was Ed Robson. And so they were the people that I was working under, if you like. But there was already, clearly, the early parts of the town the master plan was there, and the early parts of the town were already in place. Blackfell, for instance, Oxclose, the lower part of Oxclose, Glebe, and so on. And there had been some very important and creative people working under Eric Watson. Eric Watson, I'll tell you now, was a very unpleasant person. He wasn't a very good architect, but he was in fact an extremely good manager, a rather vicious manager. He knew how to get rid of people and so on. But in a way, he was very effective. He also encouraged talented people, but was happy to get rid of them when they were interfering with his ego. And everything that we did was in the name of Eric Watson. So I can absolutely claim that I was the architect for Fatfield, but that would never ever have been recorded anywhere. But if anybody wants proof, I've got plenty of proof. But that was how it was. And my predecessors were quite important. There was a man called Ian Cahoon, who was incredibly creative. What you have to understand is that at this time, it was a bit like the cathedrals being built across Europe. There were these Freemasons who moved from cathedral to cathedral. And the New Towns movement was like this. People moved from one new town to another, and they carried ideas with them. So we were very closely in touch with what was being done in places like Runcorn, Warrington, and so on. And people came from these different places. So Ian Cahoon was a key person. He fell out later with Eric Watson, and he went to Sheffield, and then he became city architect for Hull. His acolyte was a man called David Butterworth, who came from Runcorn, and he went and later became chief architect, I don't know where, somewhere. But anyway, so these people, they all added their ideas. There's another architect who perhaps is still around. Have you come across, he must be living in Washington, called Ray McCrow. Have you come across him?
I've heard the name mentioned.
And his wife was called Sylvia, and she was a quite well-known potter. And anyway, so all of these people were there before me, and I arrived, and I can remember I was given 2 jobs to do immediately, which were 2 private developments. That is to say, at that time, the Development Corporation was also doing private as well as corporation houses. And I mean, I don't mean giving areas just to private developers. We actually designed and built housing for sale. And that was, for instance, part of where did we live? Sorry, Blackfell. Part of Blackfell was private. Mm-hmm. So I was given 2 sites to do, not far from here, 2 small sites, and that was my first one. They weren't built, but I developed a lot of my own ideas about layout and so on. And at this time, Glebe was finished, and Glebe had pioneered a long terrace idea, which was working out very economically, and also was very good in terms of energy and so on. And that led to some rather very successful housing in Biddick. Mm. I'm sorry, I only know these places by their project names. So I'm talking about Biddick 4, which was designed by David Butterworth. Suddenly, I'd hardly been there any time at all when I was asked, I was really, in effect, appointed the project architect for a new village, which was Fatfield. And I remember the first thing was being briefed by Eric Watson, and then I had to take part in a couple of days, 3 or 4 days, where we just roamed over the site. And there was a planning officer and me, and one of what were called social development officers. And we had to start mapping out ideas with the topography. And of course we knew the whole concept was that a village would have 1,000 or so houses. It would be for a population of 3 to 4 to 5,000 people, and it would have various elements, a village centre, a school, and so on. It would have a proportion of corporation houses, a proportion of private houses, which could be of different categories. And there would also, in Fatfield, we knew, be an area of self-build housing. So there were the elements we had to deal with. And when we got to the site, we find, there's a main road with a string of houses on it. And off the main road is this old estate farm. Then there is this weird topography with a bowl of still farmed land at that time, going down to a stream, and the stream ran down into a very deep wooded valley, which had been, I discovered very quickly, the site of drift mines in the 16th, 17th century, very old coal workings that went down to the River Wear. So that was what we had as a starting point. So one of the things that immediately we were asked to just give ideas of, and you see, the astonishing thing is, it's very hard to put across this, that this was a time when everything you did just went ahead and got built. And if you had an idea, if it was accepted, everybody ran with it. You can't imagine how immediate it all was. And of course, we just took that for granted, and we don't realise. I mean, today, it just isn't like that. Mm. So we sort of moseyed around these old farm buildings, and I think between us, we said, well, this would make a great arts centre. And we looked inside these old buildings, and here was this big barn in the middle, and we said, I did some sketches. This would make a fantastic little theatre, And so one of the things we went back to, so that the way it worked was you went back to, and you told at one of the weekly meetings, you reported to the chief architect that this is what we were suggesting, and he would take it to the board. And I mean, that thing, it just went straight away. Everybody said, wow, yes. Unfortunately, I had nothing to do with that art centre after that. But, there was a different, because the way the architects department was organised, we were housing. And there was another group which was mainly what we called town centre and other. So they would be the ones who would do the art centre. I think they did a great job of it. But then my job was to do the master plan. And so very quickly, I came on this idea that the bowl, what we call the bowl, the idea was that we would have the housing around the bowl. Mm-hmm. The other, and then the bowl would somehow connect down with public footpaths to the riverside. And that same footpath would go up and have to cross the railway line, which is why you have your code Worley Bridge. Mm-hmm. And then we decided that if the farm was going to be the art centre, that would have to connect to the village centre. That told us where the village centre would be, where the pub had to be separate because the pub would be built by a brewery, so we wouldn't be designing there. And then there would be the village centre with the shops, and then that would go down into the bowl. And then we had the idea, which was very strong at that time, was that there were 18 different, maybe I've got the number wrong, but if my memory is right, there were going to be, on the master plan, 18 villages. And one of the sort of underlying principles, which was never really written down, but which we all followed and agreed to, was that each village should be given its own different character. That the villages, if the idea of village was going to work, the villages had to be separate entities, but they also had to have their own character to some greater degree or not. And immediately we decided that Fatfield was the most southerly village, and the slopes were down to the river. And so that made us think that we were talking about a hilltop village. And then what we had to do as architects, and submitting it through the chief architect, we had to come up with a whole proposal for the master plan, but also for the character of the village and the sort of materials and so on. And the way we did that was to create a presentation which was like a collage. So we would gather ideas of, this is what if it could be like such and such. And I had spent a lot of my holidays, and this Spanish hacienda has absolutely bugger all to do with it. Okay? I had spent a lot of my holidays as a child in a place called Robin Hood's Bay in North Yorkshire. And the idea for Fatfield came from Robin Hood's Bay. How would you deal with housing on a steep hillside? And then there were several elements that emerged from that idea. First was the pantile roof, mm-hmm. Which is the roof. And we were, obviously, everything we did wanted to relate to the northeast of England. Okay? So pantiles were a very common roof across the whole of the northeast of England. You get them in Gateshead. They were used in ballast. They came on ships from Belgium and Holland, So there was the pantile roof. And then there was the idea of using render. And the render came mainly from the houses on the main road in Fatfield. As you went down the road in Fatfield, there were these houses from the 20s, and they had render. So we said, right, we'll use render. Okay? And then the thing about Robin Hood's Bay on the hillside was that there were alleyways that went around the contours, and the houses were all on split levels. Mm-hmm. So in order to deal with this very steep contour, the idea was that we would have these roads that went in and fingers of car parking that went down, and they would feed alleyways that went along the contours. And that, when you saw it from the other side of the river, you would see a cascade of roofs, and that's what in fact was built. And the thing is, that was presented to the board, and the board, there was a woman on the board, and I've forgotten her name, but you probably will know it. She was her family owned shipyards in Sunderland or in Newcastle, in Dyemouth. Mm-hmm. And she apparently, I did this presentation, and she apparently said that afterwards, after we'd gone, this was this vision of joy or something or other, and that was, what we should go for. And Eric Watson wasn't very happy about this, and he actually came out of what we were no longer there, but he came out and he said to me, I can't repeat some of the words that he used. He was a rather foul-mouthed individual, but he, more or less said, well, there you are, you've buggered us up now. We've got to build it, and I think he had expected that the board were going to throw the idea out, but they went for it, you see. So, and I had a team of very skilled technicians, and of course, we also had I know this doesn't sound relevant, but we had incredibly skilled quantity surveyors. And everything that we were building at that time was governed by very strict rules, which were laid down in London. And there were all these rules were how they calculated how much money we were getting. And our quantity surveyors were incredibly clever. They knew all the sort of fiddles and diddles. And we got a lot of money because it was a sloping site, and so on and so on and so on. So, I remember when we were working on it, I just didn't think we would ever get it built, that it was going to be far too expensive. But one of the things which, again, it was just how you played the rules, but the longer you make the terraces, now this is a bit technical, but the longer you make the terraces, the fewer end gable walls you have. But also, in the rules, the more terrace houses you had, the more money you got. So these long, snaky terraces, they actually helped us to get more money to build the scheme. And then we had to set everything down, cut it into the hillside. And for that, we had to have these retaining walls, which were inside the houses. And again, I was incredibly nervous. I was sure that in the end, that we would have problems. But I can tell you the name of the guy who was, I was able to get various people to do research and do various things. And one of the assistants was a guy called Alan Smith, who later became Alan J. Smith. And he ended up being the deputy lieutenant of the county. But never mind, he was very successful later on. And he was the one who designed these retaining walls inside the houses. And when the houses were occupied, the first people who moved in, they were complaining of damp I thought, bloody hell, what have we done wrong? And the reason why there was damp getting in was that the GPO had put these GPO boxes, amplifier boxes, and when it rained, water got in, and this went down the ducting of the GPO cables. And there was nothing wrong with the way we solved that one, you see. That was just solved. So they were the sort of things that we were dealing with. And then we had to specify the render. Mm-hmm. Now, at that time, we were being besieged. You've got all these reps coming and do this, do that, and all these magic things that are coming from the continent. We can do through-coloured render. We've got these machines. They'll spatter it on and all of that. And one of the things I'll say about Eric Watson, the chief architect, was that he was very sceptical about any new, we would only do things if they were tried and tested. And again, this same guy, Alan Smith, I set him to work on the specification of the render. And he came back, all the research he suggested we should not use through-coloured render. We should use plain render, 3 coats and a base, and then 2 fine, and the final was this rough cast, and then we would paint it. So, and that was done. And as far as I know, I'm going to look later today, after 50 years, that render is still okay.
That's great.
And the other thing which was weird, and I'll tell you this, we had this unbelievably theoretically complicated, nonsensical, highfalutin idea about colour, which was that all the different courts, each court would have what was called a hue. And from the hue, there would be different chroma versions of the hue. And that was how there'd be this variation of houses, but they all kept together in a sort of very abstract harmony. And we were very proud of this. But of course, later, once you had right to buy and so on, people started painting the render themselves. And it's a hell of a lot better the way they've done it than the way we did it. Once people started painting the houses their way, it was really, quite good. The other story I'll tell you, which is quite interesting, about I'm now only talking about the corporation housing. We designed all these. First of all, we were told by our contractor that in Gateshead they were pulling up lots of streets with cobbles, and we could have all these cobbles for free. So in the whole documentation, we specified these cobbles. Gateshead delivered piles of these cobbles to where the school is, and they were on site. And we designed all the play areas and things with these cobbles. Okay? And then the contractor came to us and said, it's too expensive to clean the cobbles. It'll be much cheaper if we buy new cobbles from Portugal. So that's what we insisted they had to do, if they couldn't do what they said they were going to do. So I can tell you, if you ever want any old cobbles, the school playing field has several 100,000 cobbles underneath it. Okay? And all those play spaces were done with cobble. Do you know the play spaces I mean?
Yeah.
And they were done with cobbles from Portugal. And they were beautiful, and they had little animals in them. They've all gone. I don't think those play spaces are used. I don't think children play today. I think all around Washington, all the play spaces and things that were done. I mean, like in Sulgrave, we had these hippopotamuses and elephants. Yeah. They've all gone. I don't know. So anyway, so that's just how that whole thing. Now, unfortunately, the design for the village centre, it was to be a square courtyard with these arms off it. And the government at that time were trying to encourage local authorities to build special housing schemes for single young people. And they had this special directive, and there was going to be special money. So I was told I had to incorporate the single people housing in the village centre. And they had to be, there was units like there would be 6 people who shared a flat with a kitchen. It was a new experiment. And that's how we designed the village centre. And it was a complete disaster because in the end, Sunderland weren't just not interested in managing it properly. I think it was a great idea. It was quite well designed. There was nothing, but in the end, I mean, I get the impression that lots of the things that have gone wrong with Washington have, and I'm not saying everything's gone wrong by any means, but a lot of things that went wrong had to do with being taken over by Sunderland and Sunderland not being interested in the ideas. I mean, why did Washington ever have to be part of Sunderland? It was designed to be an independent town, you know. So that, unfortunately, was a disaster. And so the village centre, there aren't shops there now, and it was converted into houses. And I think as you go around the town, the village centres have, generally speaking, been a disaster.
Can I ask you, when you're saying that they're a disaster, do you think that comes from an idealistic idea of moving in young people on their own and then not providing the support that allows that?
No, I think they obviously didn't have the right management structure.
Yeah.
It was a completely new, somebody in government, they had identified a problem, which is how do young people who leave home, how do you house them? They can't afford their own house, their own flat, so you could have these, what we used to call in Sri Lanka, chummeries. So you would have a flat which had 5 or 6, it was a bit like university student housing, 5 or 6 people, each with a room, and they would share a kitchen and a bathroom, and they would live together. Well, that idea, they just didn't put in the management for it, so that didn't happen. And that meant that there aren't shops there. The pub was built, the arts centre was built, but in a way, Fatfield Village Centre is a bit of a... But if you go around today, I mean, Blackfell Village Centre is a disaster. And they've completely demolished whatever was there in our day. But your Lambton Village Centre is looking okay.
One of the lucky ones, I think.
Ayton, I was responsible for it. I did the master plan and all the housing in Ayton. So Ayton, the village centre there, seems to be there for functioning. But I think there were that idea of village centre was probably a victim to changing social habits and the idea that everybody wanted to shop. I think also, it's one of the things we can talk about later, but I mean, in the end, the master plan for Washington was predicated on the motor car.
Yeah.
And that was probably a great mistake. And so the idea of the village centre was diluted because everybody would have motor cars and they would go and do their shopping in either the town centre or they'd go to Newcastle or they'd go to Sunderland. Or now they buy everything online. So the village centres were doomed, and yet they were a very important element of the master plan, as was the bus system, which is there, but it doesn't seem to work very well. And the other important idea was that there was a whole pedestrian network. You could walk without crossing roads from one village to the other, which you can, but it's not very popular, partly because of ruffians, and I mean, going through a tunnel is pretty scary and so on. So there are things. Anyway, I'm going back to Fatfield. So we had this. I mean, part of the whole footpath system was that there was going to be a footpath that ultimately would come back up to the centre of Washington. It would link to the town park system and so on, and it would go down across coming north to south. It would cross the railway line, come down my bowl, under the footbridge of the road, down through the little wooded valley to the river. And in order for that to happen, it had to cross the railway line. So it was agreed that there would be a footbridge across the railway line. And at the same time, at that particular area, there was a high tension cable crossing. And so there was a whole gap left through the housing scheme because you couldn't build, there was a sort of sway diagram, so you couldn't build with it. So that gap's there. But of course, the high tension cable line's gone and the railway line is gone. So they remain like slightly absurd. I mean, who would cross a footbridge now when they can just walk across the railway line? Because the railway line isn't there. But then around further to the east was all the sale housing, which we had some say in, but of course the developers built the housing themselves. But it followed the precepts of the master plan. And then on the west side, there was a whole area of self-built housing where people came and built their own houses. And then at the bottom, on the other side of the river, we refurbed these lines of terraced houses, which I think was done brilliantly. We got an award for that, but I don't know how it's looking today. So that's, in a way, the story of Fatfield, I think. And of course, the Arts Centre took off. It was another part of the corporation that did the Arts Centre, but they did a lovely job of the theatre. And then they had these little workshops down the right-hand side, where there was an architect and somebody doing jewellery and I don't know whether they're still there.
Yeah, yes. There's a singing studio, a dance studio, photographers. I think.
And it's been a great success.
Yeah.
And it's a Sunderland-wide, northeastern-wide facility, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah. So that's one thing that has been successful.
Exactly.
End of that.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to ask both of you, actually, first of all, when you arrived in 68, is that right?
No, I arrived in 73.
73.
And I ended in 79.
79. And where did you go to after that?
Well, the first thing was that the writing was on the wall. Mrs. Thatcher was going to completely demolish the whole New Town movement. Mm-hmm. And it was clear that, my job prospects were zero because, the whole idea when we were students, the whole line that we were going through was that our careers would be in either local or national government. We would be working, we were told, you'll end up being borough architect for Gateshead or something or other, But it was clear in 1978, 79, that was never going to happen. And Mrs. Thatcher declared war on almost everything to do with the new towns. Yeah. The whole idea of planning, the whole idea of community. There's no such thing as community, she said. We're all individuals. And the right to buy destroyed so much of the ideas of the housing. We were always, all the way through, from the beginning, we passed from one generation to the other. Implicit in the master plan was the idea that we were building for designing community, and that we were, designing. That's why we're using curves and so on. That we were creating sort of enveloping spaces that seemed to suggest community, and that there would be shared spaces which would be landscape maintained by the development corporation. And hopefully into the future by the local authority. And car parking spaces were often shared and so on. And then the other thing which we did, which seemed to have gone completely wrong, every house that we did, after very, very detailed discussions with all the local authorities, had a bin meter cupboard. And the bin meter cupboard was all sized to deal with a dustbin being collected once a week. And all of that was completely torn up by Sunderland. So now you could call Washington Binnington because it is just absolutely littered with these wheelie bins everywhere. And for me, it is incredibly distressing. Mm. And the other thing I should just also mention, which clearly hits you today, is that we were very, very much tied by the housing cost yardstick. And it at different times, at one stage we were allowed to build garages and then we weren't allowed to build garages. Mm. But the number of car parking spaces was very, very strictly laid out. So I know that Fatfield, I think, was 1.4 or 1.5 cars per dwelling. And it's clear, I don't know what Fatfield, I haven't been to Fatfield for 4 or 5 years, but we saw it today. It also has to do with density. The different towns, the different villages had different densities. So Lambton is a slightly lower density than Ayton. So you see in Ayton, there's quite a severe car parking problem because the number of cars far exceeds what was anticipated in the mid-1970s. And I think Fatfield, I don't know. We'll see how Fatfield fared as far as cars was concerned. But it's clear that the inherent in the master plan was this idea that it was going to be a car city. But in the end, we weren't able to provide the amount of car parking spaces that really the future was going to demand. So they're the things that it seems to me aren't working. And, you can say, I can say somehow, it's not mea culpa because our hands were tied. And I would have preferred, I mean, you can see it in certain places, I would have preferred to have had more of the car parking in separate parking areas and not necessarily in front of the dwellings. But anyway, that's where we ended up. But it has to do with, you see, when we got to before my time, but doing Oxclose and Glebe, the idea of Glebe and Oxclose was that they were near to the town centre, so they had to be higher density. And higher density means how many houses per hectare. And that then means how many cars you get per hectare. And if every house is actually creating a demand for 3 car spaces, if for every 100 houses, you're going to have 300 car spaces. Yeah. And that ends up, if you're building, I think Glebe is about 80 houses per hectare. Yeah. That means like perhaps today, in today's terms, 250 to 300 cars per hectare, which is a hell of a lot of cars. Anyway, Fatfield and Rickleton, I was involved with Rickleton, and Albany were the mid phase, of, if you like Oxclose and Blackfell were the early phase. And then the later phase was Lambton and Rickleton.
And this is where
and that's where
you come in.
Yeah.
So a brief history, just that David went through his past. My past was very, very straightforward. I left school in 1969, got enough grades to get into Newcastle University to read architecture. I started to dabble in housing. I was chasing money to keep my family, my wife together in the early 70s. And I started working on housing in Newcastle, mainly refurbishment projects, and just got a certain skill set there. For reasons that are a little bit hazy now, possibly to do with money, which makes me sound very mercenary, in 75, I joined the corporation. I think I had a series of opportunities I could do. I could go to London. Some of my fellow architects went to London. We all graduated in 75. And I needed somewhere with the possibility of good experience. I had to get my professional practice agreed in 1 year. Anyway, I ended up at Washington from 75 onwards. And I joined in 75. My recollection is that I wasn't interviewed by Eric Watson that David referred to. My memory says I was interviewed by the deputy guy. I was offered a salary package.
He was called Henderson.
Henderson. What did I say?
You didn't say anything.
Mr. Henderson interviewed me, and I joined. I wasn't thrilled about it. It seemed a slightly badly organised organisation. Not a company, but an organisation. It didn't seem very focused, and I remember feeling, what am I doing here? So I drifted along. I mean, the first project I worked on that I can recall in detail was Albany, which had been designed previously. I was allowed to be supervising architect on site. I had signed certification. I got money sorted out and all the rest of it. That one all happened. And then later in the mid-70s, at 76 or maybe early 77, I found myself working on Lambton Village. I briefly worked on the housing element leading up to creating a focus for the village of the village centre. You've seen the village centre. To this day, I have no idea where the clock tower came from. No idea. I came up with the idea of a very formal square. As David's alluded, if you understood how the cost index worked, you could get away with certain things. It's a very expensive walkway wrapping around the square, expensive materials in the car park areas. And we worked under a spatial control system called Parker Morris, and all the units had to be certain sizes. Internally, there had to be a thing called a pram space, because everybody was perceived to possibly have a Silver Cross pram. I kid you not, that was vetted by a man from London. So somehow I generated enough volume in both vertical and horizontal to create this tower. How I got away with the clock, which apparently just about works even after 50 years. I don't know where that came from. Why the clock tower?
Because there was a very strong idea that every village should have its own identity, and that there be the word, which is a local northeastern word, every village centre should have a feature. And the feature of Lambton was a clock.
And I my ego says that I came up with that idea, but I can't be absolute.
Maybe you did.
Maybe I did.
But it was accepted. Why, that's our feature. You see, like the Black Fell had the worm sculpture. That was the feature in a water feature.
There's a brick mural on the back of the village centre in Lambton with the Lambton worm. Yeah. It's not terribly artistic, but it's still there. To develop the whole of the village concept for Lambton Village, we built a 1 to 200 polystyrene model. Somewhere in my archives, I have a photograph of this model. I'm hoping I will find it.
We had a model making department, and your polystyrene model.
Well, somebody made the polystyrene model.
In the model making. I have photographs of the most incredible models of Fatfield, for instance. Well, everything was made and the model maker was this. There were two of them, and they were brilliant.
Well, if I can find these photographs, we had contour lines generated by individual pieces of cork stuck together. So you know how a contour generates a hillside and all the rest of it. Yeah. The levels in Lambton were they weren't particularly difficult to deal with. And in that polystyrene model, I just wish I could find it. Obviously, if I do find it, I'd be very happy to give you a copy of the view. There is a model of the polystyrene clock tower and the wraparound square and all the rest of it.
But I think that wraparound square, having been to it today and looked at it again, I do think Lambton is it's probably one of the only village centres that really works. Mm. It's still, you look at it, and you think, yeah, this is a village centre, you know? Mm. And maybe the clock tower helps. I think the relationship of the old people's housing to the centre is brilliant. And the way the parking works, I think it really functions. And you say, yes, this is the centre of Lambton.
So at some point, having started work together I've got another name to give you. There were two people, I think, who were on the same grade in the office. My senior officer was Colin Sanderson. There were two housing groups in the housing department in the DC, and my line manager boss was Colin Sanderson. Below him were me as a junior architect and another junior architect called Chris Paget, and Chris Paget did most of the snaky housing, as David described. Getting the best value for money by lots and lots of running terraces, zigzags, and changes of direction, all the rest of it. And I'm going to be totally frank, Chris and I didn't get on very well for whatever reasons, just like David didn't get on with Eric and all the rest of it. And at some point, Sanderson, dear old fella, he gave me carte blanche on the village centre and the elderly person's housing. And at the tender age of mid to late 20s, I think I was 26 or something, 27 or something, I had this job. If you value the job now at present day prices, you can say it was between 4.5 and 6 million. And there I am, a young architect, doing all the design with a little bit of help coming in, the landscape and the costings and other things, and possibly this lovely guy looking over at my shoulder. Who knows?
I had nothing to do with it. You weren't in my group.
I wasn't in your group.
We just happened to we got friends because we were travelling together from Newcastle.
I don't remember you contributing.
I never had anything you were in Colin Sanderson's team. You weren't in my team.
Anyway, I was given this tremendous...
I wouldn't have had you in my team.
Thank you for that, David. I love you too.
I'm pulling your leg.
And all I can remember is having virtually, if not total control, the majority of the design decisions were mine. I designed a very simple detail where the timber columns came down on the walkway. They were on a kind of steel stirrup. And the idea of that was to prevent rain penetrating and damaging the timber. And they may have been maintained well over the years, but they're still there and they're working quite well.
But unfortunately, in the old people's housing, they didn't use the stirrup detail.
I don't know why that happened. If you look closely at the elderly person's housing, some of the roofs have got vertical curves on because post A and post B have settled slightly, and
it's because they've been affected by damp rot.
I can't comment on how that happened, but there's one view I'm very proud of. There's a view where you can look through the primary axis of the village centre, and you can almost look all the way through the elderly person's housing. So there was always a design link between the people who needed support, the shops, the pub, the community hub opposite, which then has now moved into part of the main building I designed. In 1983, after I'd left the corporation, I left in 78 for all sorts of personal reasons, and I went to Milton Keynes and made more mischief down there. I haven't been interviewed by them, but what was I going to say? That yes, in 1983, it won a Civic Trust Award, which I'm really proud of, which I found out years later. What I've been unable to find for certain is what the award was for. My ego tells me it was definitely for the village centre, but it might have been for the elderly person's housing as well. But I can't find it in print.
I think it's both.
I can't find it in
print. But you see, the interesting thing is, we worked, all of us, or not all, but both of us, we worked on schemes which got awards, and our name never appeared. So we got an award for Fatfield, and we got an award for the housing by the river, the refurbishment, and you got the award for the village centre, and we never ever was our name mentioned. So, and that today would be challenged, it would be illegal. But in those days, it was just the way it was too. And you just accepted it, you know.
So whose name was on the award?
Eric Watson.
Eric Watson.
Whose name we always called him Sparrow's Ankles. Can I just say something in relation to something you said?
What did I say?
Well, you said you arrived and you thought it seemed very chaotic. And I think that's really unfair. I think
that's my naivety as a young architect, just qualified.
I actually think I found it the most astonishing place to work in. I think there was this excitement of building, and the people who worked on it, all of the staff, whether it was landscape, architecture, planning, the engineers, the social development, which was a very important element, social development. They were all people who were really enthused and committed to the idea that we were building something great. And they were, a lot of the people who worked in the Development Corporation, I think the total staff was about 500, I might be wrong, but a lot of them were local, either Washington, Sunderland, Gateshead, or, and somebody like me, I would almost claim to be semi-local, in that I was born in Stockton and my parents came from Crook. So I felt myself, to me, I was working on something in the northeast. And I think there was a great spirit. Plus, I do think that the organisation, although I've said these unpleasant things about Eric Watson and so on, it was a system that actually, it really worked. And the thing is, what I will say about Eric Watson was that if you did something and it went to his weekly meeting, and if he accepted it, he then backed it up. And he took it to the next level. There was a hierarchy of decision making which went up to the board. And once the board had accepted something, everybody, fell in behind it. And I think there were a lot of people there who were in their own fields were really very, very good. We had extremely good quantity surveyors, we had good planners, the landscape people were fantastic. I think that it's so sad we hear today that people are moaning that there are too many trees in Washington. And they just should go to the town centre and see the photographs they've got up on the wall there. This place was an industrial wasteland. You could stand up on the top of Ayton and look down, and it was just like looking over a desert. And these trees are incredible, and I don't know why people don't celebrate. So we were trying to think of all the words we would use to describe Washington. So one was leafy, another was windy, noisy, because it's still astonishing. You get, when you live here, you get used to it. The noise from the motorway, it comes all, noisy, friendly. People are very friendly.
Very friendly.
Yeah.
And we kind of ran out at that point. We're trying to get 10 words.
We're going to get 10 words.
We're sorted out over our visit time.
But I think it was...
I think those words already. I think the noise in particular, in recording this podcast, we've spent a lot of time recording the background noise because it's fascinating. It's just there. Always. Yeah.
And I think if you live here, you very quickly just take it for granted, don't you?
You do. Yeah. You just tune it out. So, Richard, you were born in Stockton.
Yeah.
Whereabouts were you born, Richard?
I was born in the Middle East.
The Middle East, wow.
Born in Jordan.
Jordan.
My father was in the British Army, and I was a forces child.
Right.
Ended up, before university, I went to grammar school in Reading in Berkshire. So I'm definitely a southerner. Mm-hmm. And I think that drew me back in 78. I was married for the first time, and I just wanted to go back to my roots. Ended up at Milton Keynes. It was a good place at Milton Keynes. And then, as David quite rightly summarised very well, when once Thatcher got in, the whole process of the New Towns movement seemed to lose momentum. The rules changed. Oh, I was going to mention. I mentioned Parker Morris, and that in 1980, 81, that went overnight. It was one day it was there, the next day no, and all the space standards. Right down. So 82, I moved into the private sector and had a reasonably good career. I still work for myself as a one-off architect now.
It's amazing.
Sole principal.
It's amazing. So, just from your individual viewpoints, and Ursula, I'm thinking of you as well here. When you first came into Washington, like you say, you're describing an industrial wasteland in some senses. Did it still feel like an industrial wasteland
by 75, it was getting quite together by then. Mm-hmm. I don't remember seeing the dereliction of the coal mining, the open cast mines.
The pit was still there. It was being dismantled in the 70s. The big pit heap.
What's the big mining machine called? The one with the spinning wheels that takes the pit head. Yeah. I think there were one or two of those still in the distance, but suddenly they were gone.
Well, we lived. I mean, our next door neighbour were coal miners. And you were very friendly with Lucy. We'd love to know what happened to Lucy.
I was, yes. I got on very well. I had just come from Zurich. Had some trouble understanding her husband, who spoke a very broad local accent, which I had never heard before. So I had a bit some trouble with that. But she was very welcoming, and we helped each other out. And
to this day, I love the Geordie accent. I hope I have almost no accent. I suggest I just have a southern British accent. Yeah. But Geordie accent, I love the team. I love the idea of coming to Geordie land regularly, and I've done that over the years. I'm just very happy here. But I live in the south now.
So I had this, my childhood, although I was born in Stockton, I spent a lot of time in Crook with my father's family. And I sort of grew up with the idea of what a coal mining community was, because Crook was a coal mining town, though it no longer is, of course. And I think very early on in my, I began to think that all of this nostalgia about coal mining was a load of nonsense, because it's the most appalling work, and this Johnny, who lived next door to us in Blackfell, I mean, his day when he was at that time, the way the coal industry had moved eastwards, I mean, he was going about 8 miles to wherever it was, somewhere south of Washington, and then they were going 6 or 7 miles under the sea. And, it was pretty dreadful work. And I'd just like to tell you one little story, which was about Ayton, and that, Ayton, and there was a pit at the centre of Ayton, but also all of the land of Ayton had been subject to coal workings at some point. And we were given all these drawings from the coal board, and we had to design everything to avoid fault lines and so on. It was astonishingly complicated. And all of the houses in Ayton have got control joints every 2 or 3 houses so that they can settle. You wouldn't know that. But anyway, I remember early on, so this would have been 74, 75, one summer's day, going across this field with one of my colleagues, and in the corner of the field were 3 old men sitting on the ground, and they all had handkerchiefs in knots, and they were sitting in the sun. And they yelled out, one of them says, "What are you doing here?" So we said, "We're from the corporation." "And what are you doing here then?" And we said, "Well, we're starting to work on the next village." And I said, "I suppose you're probably not in favour of that." He said, "Of course we're in favour of it." He said, "It's wonderful." He said, "You know, when I was 15, my father said to me, 'You've got a week to get a job. And if you haven't got a job, you go and do in the pit.'" And he said, "I went to the bank. I'd heard they were looking for people at the bank. And the bank manager said to me, 'But you're a fit and healthy young man. I'm not taking you in the bank. Get yourself down the pit.'" And men had only two job possibilities. One was the coal mining and the other was Newell's.
Yeah.
And
What a choice.
What a choice. And the idea you could be nostalgic about that, to me, was just nonsense. And my idea in coming to Washington was the idea of creating a new community with new industries. And of course, the thing that changed everything, and I'm sure it happened partly because of Washington, was the Nissan car factory. And that was the Nissan car factory was an incredible boom to this area. And
82, 83,
Yeah.
something like that.
yeah, so, but I don't think Nissan would have come here if it hadn't been for Washington.
No.
And I just think it's a tragedy that Washington has ended up as a suburb of Sunderland. The target for Washington was a town of 70,000. And that's totally viable as a town.
Yeah.
If you parallel that with Milton Keynes, they created a complete council team that then took over the whole responsibility for the new city.
Yeah.
When that changeover took place, it was 250,000. It's now 1/3 And that changeover has kept the city viable in terms of visual quality and all sorts of good stuff. Obviously, it's a shortage of money, austerity, of course, but I think the management process is much better there.
I think Sunderland always regarded us as a load of bloody nuisances. And when Sunderland took over Washington, I don't think they were in the least bit, their planners and so on, they weren't in the least bit interested in following any of the principles and ideas that had developed here.
Yeah.
And that I just think is very sad.
Nothing we can do about it now.
Yeah.
It's sad. I think the village centres are certainly something very sad. I think the town centre is nothing more than an out-of-town shopping centre. You know, and I find now that the library is closed.
It's reopening, to be fair.
But the swimming pool has been moved, you know. It doesn't feel like the centre of a town, I'm afraid. And I think in a way, perhaps Lambton Village Centre is rather important because Lambton Village Centre represents what the villages were intended to be like, you know. And you know, as I say, the reason for Fatfield not working had to do with that particular sort of housing. I did Rickleton Village Centre. That's not bad. Rickleton's okay. Though I'm very sad because I designed a rather revolutionary bus shelter, but that has been demolished.
I've heard about that bus shelter. Yeah.
Well, I have a feeling the reason why it got demolished is that it was it was circular and I think that it was popular with courting couples, and I suspect that because it wasn't visible, so I think
Too much information.
there was too much nookie going on. So I think that's what happened to it. I don't know, but the village centre is still all right. It may not be as great as it could have been, and it could well be that in the future, I could imagine. See, what I find is a bit sad is all these people who build fences around things.
Yes.
Yeah.
Me too.
And maybe the next generation will come along and be saying, why are all these fences? We'll pull them down.
Yeah.
And they may rediscover how we hoped it would be.
Mm.
And it's really nice that, for instance, it was a microcosm, this housing, the old people's housing in Lambton. The idea was that all of these old people, each person from their kitchen can see into the courtyard, and the covered ways, they're a place where people can sit out. So there's a huge sense of community there. And that was, in a way, perhaps in a more extreme version for old people, but that's how we imagined Washington to be, a series of communities. And a village would contain a mixture of private housing and corporation housing, and within the private housing, different types of private housing. But there would always be a mixing. And the places where the people would mix would be the schools and the pub and so on and so on. And I mean, that was the sort of thing that was anathema to Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah.
That was the sort of thing that she declared war on. And we've all become far more individualistic.
Yes.
And if you go back, the thing about the coal mining communities was that the people depended on each other.
Yeah.
Literally.
You depended on your workmates. Your life was in their hands. Their life was in your hands. You had to cooperate with the people you work with. And at home, also, you had to cooperate. And if people were injured or whatever, and there was this very strong, and the couple who we talked to this morning, she's now got children, grandchildren. Some of them have gone off to Sweden, to God knows where, but the core of her family is still in Washington.
That came up in the conversation.
Yes.
Her extended family,
Yes.
they were all born here in various corners of this town, and they're all still communicating. The grandchildren, as David said, some of them have gone, pursuing new goals overseas, wherever. But the core of that beautiful northeast extended family concept, which you don't get in the south, you really don't. Even maybe in corners of London you do, but that continuing link across blood, it's a joy to see it working well.
And also what she was telling us, she wasn't boasting, it was just what came out, was clearly how successful that third generation, some of them have been.
Yes.
They've been to university, one grandson is an engineer, and another has got an important job. And so, I mean, you know, whatever we say, the new town has been enabling for people, and I think that was one of the reasons for it, you know.
Great success.
Yeah.
But it could have been better.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, you have to see politics come into it, that
Yes.
that a succession of Tory governments, all right, there's been Labour governments in between, but, you know, the ideas behind a new town do not chime with Tory policies. And you could argue that in a sort of way, the concept of the new town is a socialist sort of idea, in the sense that the very beginning of it, you have an Act of Parliament, you designate an area, and you say, this corporation has the power to purchase land at pre-designation prices and develop that land. And the bedrock of that idea, I think, is brilliant. And you can see that it goes against certainly the sort of Sunakian sort of view of the world. And I hope that with the Labour government, maybe there will be talk of new towns, but I hope that when we do that, there will be a period of really a post-mortem on the, you know, earlier new towns, what went right, what went wrong. And I think things did go right in Washington, but the town centre is a total disaster. So if I was doing a new town again, I would want, big question, how do you do the centre of a new town?
One of the finest examples in the world is Milton Keynes Central Building.
Yeah.
It's 3/4 of a mile long. It's got 2 anchor stores, one at each end, It's a beautiful experience spatially. It's got some fundamental design decisions which are so clever and just yet they appear so simple. And it's just a beautiful building, and it holds the whole centre of the city together.
I mean, one completely daft idea with it that totally works is that all the servicing is on the roof. All the deliveries go up on the roof.
So there's nothing underground, no tunnels, nothing.
Yeah.
So you're not aware of it, but on a whole level
Everything
above
comes down, drops down into the shop units.
And then because it's got this long perimeter, the parking is all the way around and the public transport, and you can be very close to where you want to be. So
and a railway station as well.
Yeah. What happened to me afterwards? Well, first of all, at the end I did Ayton, and it was then very clear that the new town was running down. And in fact, strangely enough, I didn't have a very good relationship with Eric Watson, but I got on very well with Stephen Holly, who was the general manager. And I don't know why, but I quite often seemed to end up going down to London on trains where he was going to, so we often chatted on the train. But it was partly through him. The government set up in about 1977, they set up a new organisation which had the incredible name of Budzu. And that stands, you'd think it was a Buddhist organisation, but it's British Urban Development Services Unit. And it was set up to sell Newtown's know-how abroad. And I was seconded to that. And I spent time in London working for that. And partly as a result of that, the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka came on a visit in 78, 79 to England, and he was taken to Milton Keynes by Heseltine. And the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka said, will you send me a team of experts to help me build new towns in Sri Lanka? I'd already been in Sri Lanka because I helped to set up the School of Architecture 10 years earlier. And out of the blue, I was asked, would I go to Sri Lanka and head up this team of a dozen experts who were going to do new towns in Sri Lanka. So Ursula and I ended up going to Sri Lanka in 1979. Of course, my team ended up as 3 people, me and 2 others. And it turned out that a lot of what we were expected to do was just to advise on the design of housing, low-cost housing for village redevelopment and so on. But very soon after I got there, I was summoned to the Prime Minister, and he said, I want you to do the master plan for this new town, and it'll be called Rampakunagama, the village of the Golden Pond. And you've got 3 weeks. And I had this team, and we worked away, and in 3 weeks we presented a whole master plan and a model and drawings and everything. And I hung around and wanted, and the permanent secretary said, what are you waiting for? Well, I want to know what's happening next. Have you accepted? Oh, it's fantastic. No worries. So I said, well, what do we do now? Oh, you don't have to do anything. We've got these Korean contractors, and they're just going to start building it. And they came and it was totally unlike Washington. They put a fence around this enormous area. They brought about 500 people in from Korea, and they got about 1,000 locals, and they worked away at this for 2 years. It was about 2,500 houses. It wasn't anything like the size of Washington, but it was a town. And at the end of 2 years, they blew a whistle, and they took down the fence, and here was this town just waiting. And
wonderful.
And so that's what I did after Washington.
Fascinating. Yeah.
And it's still there today. Every time it's now got a population of about 20,000. It's grown.
That's amazing.
And
I moved out of housing after a few years. I went into business parks, and I had a really successful career, mainly in Cambridge and 1 or 2 other places. I did occasional housing, but I was I'd done enough through MK, Milton Keynes, and here, and I wanted to be more commercial. And I achieved that. I now do domestic extensions for Mr. and Mrs. Smith on the south coast near Brighton.